The night my family laughed at me in public, I told myself I would never forget the sound. It was not loud at first. It started with one joke, then another, then that familiar wave of group laughter people use when they want to prove they are on the winning side of the room. I stood there smiling for a few seconds, because that is what people do when humiliation happens too fast to process. But inside, something had already changed. Because it was not only strangers laughing. It was my brother, my father, my aunt, people who knew exactly where to hit because they knew me well enough to know what would hurt. And what none of them understood was this. That night did not end with the laughter. It kept moving, quietly. Weeks later, the business they all treated like the family's greatest achievement started to fail. And when it did, everyone suddenly wanted to act like humiliation, arrogance, and denial had nothing to do with it. Stories like this are why people listen to exposed stories media. Not because embarrassment is entertaining, because public humiliation usually reveals something deeper that was already wrong long before anyone laughed. People do not mock you in front of others unless they have already decided your dignity matters less than the story they want the room to believe. My family owned a business together, not a giant corporation, not some glamorous empire, but big enough in our town that people knew the name and treated it like proof that our family had done well. It was a regional home supply company my grandfather started decades earlier. My father expanded it. My older brother, Daniel, modernized it. By the time I was in my early 30s, the business had become more than income. It was family identity. My father was the kind of man who believed business success proved character. He respected discipline, long hours, and public image. If the company was doing well, he felt our family was doing well. If the company looked strong, he believed we looked strong too. My brother Daniel understood that better than anyone. He was 4 years older than me and had always known how to become the center of any room without seeming desperate for attention. He was charming in the way ambitious people often are. Not warm exactly. Efficiently likable. People trusted him quickly. He knew when to sound bold, when to sound practical, and when to make other people feel as though they were lucky to be included in his plans. By the time he stepped into a leadership role at the company, everyone around him had already accepted the idea that he was the future of the family business. No one said it that directly, but that was the mood in every room. I was different. I handled operations and internal reporting for a while, then shifted into vendor oversight and logistics. My job was less visible and less glamorous. I noticed patterns. I looked for friction points. I worried about things before they became public problems. That made me useful when people wanted accuracy. It also made me inconvenient when they wanted momentum. For years, I got along with Daniel well enough. Not perfectly, but well enough. We had the kind of sibling relationship many adults maintain after growing up in the same demanding household. Some history, some tension, some loyalty. Nothing dramatic on the surface. But over time, one difference between us became harder to ignore. Daniel believed confidence could solve most problems. I believed confidence without documentation usually created them. That difference mattered more once the company started growing faster. In the year 2022, Daniel pushed hard for expansion. He wanted a new distribution center, new inventory categories, more leverage, more speed, more outside capital. My father loved it. He said Daniel had vision. He said the business had been playing too small for too long. He said this was how legacy companies either evolved or died. I was not against growth. That is important. People later acted like I was just negative by nature, but that was never true. I questioned the timing, the financing structure, and several of the assumptions behind the projected returns. There is a difference between caution and sabotage, but families built on ego rarely respect that difference. I started raising concerns quietly, not in front of clients, not in front of staff. Eternally. I pointed out cash flow compression during seasonal downturns. I flagged vendor concentration risks. I questioned whether projected demand justified the debt load Daniel wanted to take on. Each time, Daniel had an answer. Always smooth. Always immediate. Always framed in a way that made my questions sound technically valid but emotionally small. That was his real skill. He never argued like a man under pressure. He responded like a man slightly embarrassed on my behalf for not seeing the bigger picture. And in a family that admired visible certainty, that style worked. The event where everything broke happened at the company's annual expansion celebration. Daniel insisted on calling it that. Not a client dinner, not a partner event, a celebration. It was held at a hotel ballroom downtown with investors, suppliers, local press, and more extended family than I thought necessary. My father wanted the room full. He said a crowded room proves legitimacy. My mother spent all week talking about how proud she was. My aunt told everyone Daniel was about to take the company to another level. Even relatives who barely understood what the business did kept repeating the same phrase. This is a big moment for the family. I did not want to go. That is the truth. Not because I am antisocial. Because by then I had already seen enough internal strain to know the event felt premature. The expansion deal had unresolved financing issues, one key supplier was slow on commitments, and our internal revenue forecasts depended on timing assumptions that made me deeply uncomfortable. But family businesses do not respect private reluctance. My father told me I needed to be there. He said whether I agreed with every step or not, we showed up for each other publicly. That sentence sounds noble until you realize how often publicly matters more than truthfully. The ballroom was exactly what Daniel wanted. Polished lighting, branded displays, a stage set up near the far wall with the company logo projected behind it. The whole room was built to create confidence before anyone asked for detail. Daniel moved through it beautifully. He shook hands, remembered names, and laughed at the right volume. He made investors feel seen. He made our parents glow. For the first hour, I stayed near the back, speaking only when spoken to. A supplier I trusted asked how the new facility timeline was progressing. I said there were still moving parts. Before I could say more, Daniel appeared beside me and answered for me. He said, "My brother sees risk in everything. That's why we keep him around." The supplier laughed. It was not cruel laughter yet, just social laughter. The kind people use when a founder sounds playfully self-aware and confident enough to dismiss internal caution without seeming threatened. I gave a tight smile and let it pass. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the theme of the evening. Later, during Daniel's speech, he started talking about how every successful business needs believers and skeptics. Then he looked at me across the room and said, "In our family, I got the vision." He got the anxiety. The room laughed again, this time louder, because now people understood there was a role they were being invited to play. I was not the operations guy with substantive concerns. I was the nervous brother whose caution made Daniel look even bolder by contrast. My father laughed too. That is the detail that stayed with me longest. Not because he meant harm, maybe, but because in that room, with everyone watching, he chose Daniel's momentum over my dignity without even thinking twice. Then my aunt added something from her table. She called out, "That's why some people run businesses and some people alphabetize folders." More laughter. I still remember the exact heat in my face. Because now it was no longer founder stage teasing or business theater. It was humiliation, public, targeted, and safe for everyone else because Daniel had framed it first. I should have left immediately. Instead, I stayed for another 20 minutes because humiliation has a way of freezing the body before it frees it. People kept approaching me with smirking sympathy and harmless little comments about how every family needs a pessimist. One investor's wife told me I must keep them all grounded, which sounds kind until you hear the tone. Then Daniel came over with a drink in his hand and said quietly, "Relax. The room loves it." That sentence ended something in me, because it meant he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the joke had become social positioning. He knew I had become part of the staging. I set down my glass and walked out without saying goodbye. No scene, no final line. Just the long hallway out of the ballroom, past mirrored walls and staff who looked away politely because they recognized shame when they saw it. When I got to the parking garage, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. "Please don't make tonight about your feelings." That was when I understood the problem was larger than Daniel. My family was not merely overlooking the truth. They were actively choosing the easier story. And the easier story was that I was overreacting, because admitting what happened would force them to question the man and the business they were so invested in believing. The next morning, I did not apologize. I did not call Daniel. I did not answer my aunt. Instead, I reopened the internal reports I had been quietly tracking for months and reviewed them from the beginning without the last shred of brotherly benefit of the doubt I had still been giving him. And the more I looked, the more I realized something terrible. The company's problem was not only arrogance. It was that arrogance had already started becoming financial reality. The laughter at the party had not come from strength. It had come from a room desperately committed to confidence while the numbers underneath it were beginning to slide. When I reviewed the internal numbers again after the party, I was no longer reading them as a concerned brother. I was reading them as someone who had finally accepted that Daniel would rather humiliate me than let people take my concerns seriously. That changes how you look at everything. Emotion can distort judgment. It can also remove the last illusion. The first issue was margin compression. Publicly, Daniel had been speaking as though the expansion would improve operational efficiency almost immediately. Internally, that was not what the numbers supported. Transportation costs had risen faster than projected, onboarding delays at the new facility were heavier than expected, and one major vendor relationship was already unstable enough to affect timing. None of that meant disaster on its own. What mattered was how the information was being framed. The investor deck used rounded language that made volatility sound like temporary noise. Management notes used optimism where caution was warranted. And in two separate internal files, revenue recognition timing had been presented in ways that exaggerated near-term strength. Again, not always illegal, but very dangerous when combined with debt, public claims, and a founder who increasingly treated scrutiny as personal disloyalty. I sent one final memo. Short, precise, documented. No emotional language, no references to the party. Just a clear statement that the company was at risk of overstating operational stability while underestimating short-term liquidity pressure, and that any public confidence campaign should be moderated until the vendor and financing issues were materially resolved. Daniel replied 4 hours later. 3 sentences. Noted. You are no longer part of strategic review discussions. Please limit yourself to assigned operational work. That was the first formal move. Not a termination. Not yet. A narrowing. The kind companies use when someone becomes professionally inconvenient but is still too embedded to remove cleanly. I forwarded the email to my private account. That mattered later. The first visible crack appeared less than 2 weeks after the party. A payment to a freight partner was delayed long enough that service windows tightened. Then a planned inventory transfer missed schedule. Then one of the small business publications that had praised Daniel's expansion story ran an update using the phrase integration timing headwinds. That phrase sounds harmless to ordinary readers. Inside business, it means someone is already struggling to make reality match the pitch. My father ignored it at first. He said press always dramatizes transitions. My mother said all businesses go through difficult stretches. My aunt, the same one who joked about my folders, told me I was probably enjoying being proven sort of right. That sentence almost impressed me with its cruelty, because even then, with the company beginning to wobble, preserving Daniel's image still mattered more to them than acknowledging what had happened at the party or what was unfolding underneath the headlines. The next real warning came through a supplier I had known for years. He called me privately because he did not fully understand my role had changed. He asked whether the company was having temporary cash timing issues or whether he should start protecting his exposure on future orders. People do not ask that unless worry has already escaped into the market. I asked what he was seeing. He mentioned delayed remittances, revised schedules, and more pressure from our side to extend terms than he had ever experienced before. That fit exactly what I feared. The company was not simply growing awkwardly, it was stretching. And stretched companies become fragile faster than confident people admit. I documented the conversation and said nothing publicly. Not because I wanted the company to fail. That part is important. There is a cruel fantasy people often project onto stories like this, the idea that a humiliated person must secretly want collapse because collapse would validate them. That is not how it felt. I wanted the company to stop pretending. I wanted them to tell the truth early enough that correction was still possible. But by then, Daniel was no longer interested in correction. He was interested in narrative protection. A week later, I got a message from one of the junior finance analysts. He apologized for bothering me and said he was not sure who else would answer honestly. Then he asked whether it was normal for management to revise cash visibility reports before lender review meetings. I told him to be specific. He said certain categories were being grouped differently week to week, and he couldn't tell whether he was looking at evolving reality or evolving presentation. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. Evolving presentation. There it was. I asked who signed off on the revisions. He said Leonard, our CFO, with Daniel always copied. Leonard had been Daniel's favorite kind of executive from the day he joined. Polished, unflappable, skilled at speaking about aggressive assumptions as if they were disciplined inevitabilities. I had distrusted him quietly for months, but distrust is not proof. Then the analyst sent me a screenshot. An internal comparison sheet with one tab labeled Board View and another labeled Cash Truth. I stared at those words for a long time. Cash Truth. Someone inside the company had literally created language dividing presentation from underlying reality. That is not ordinary optimism. That is organizational self-awareness at the edge of deception. I asked the analyst to send nothing else to my work email. Then I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for nearly an hour. Because at that point, I knew this was no longer about my professional judgment being mocked in public. The company was becoming exactly the kind of place where honest caution had to be made ridiculous so selective storytelling could keep functioning. 3 days later, the first lender pressure became visible. Nothing catastrophic. Just a revised line and an earnings-related communication about covenant flexibility and timing negotiations. But markets hear words like flexibility differently when confidence has already become too glossy. The stock dipped. Not dramatically, just enough for people to notice. Daniel posted online anyway, smiling photos from the party, bold captions about building through noise. Language about vision, resilience, and not listening to small minds in important moments. Small minds. That was not aimed only at the market. It was aimed at me. My mother liked the post. So did my aunt. I cannot fully explain why that detail hurt as much as it did, but it did. Because it meant the public alignment had survived even after the first crack. They still preferred the lie. The first real fall began in the 3rd week. An analyst note questioned whether the company's growth narrative depended too heavily on non-recurring assumptions and poorly supported integration timelines. Then another questioned short-term liquidity and counterparty dependence. The stock dropped harder. This time my father called. His voice had changed. Less triumphant, less certain. He asked whether I thought the market was overreacting. I told him the market rarely overreacts to opacity. It reacts to uncertainty created by a mismatch between confidence and clarity. He asked if I believed Daniel had known things were this unstable at the time of the party. I paused. Then I said yes. Not because I wanted to hurt him, because by then I had evidence that management was already separating board view from cash truth. Daniel may not have known every future consequence, but he knew enough to understand that public mockery of caution served him strategically. My father was quiet for a long time after that. Then he asked if I still had my memos. I said yes. That was the first moment I felt the family atmosphere shifting. Not toward truth yet, just away from blind protection. The actual twist came through an old archived document I had forgotten existed. Months earlier, before the party, Daniel had asked for a scenario analysis on what would happen if vendor delays, slower integration, and debt service timing all hit during the same quarter. I had prepared it reluctantly because he framed it as stress testing for lenders. When I reopened the file, I saw my own summary line at the bottom. If confidence strategy continues without corresponding reporting discipline, reputational damage may arrive before operational correction is possible. The date stunned me. It was 2 weeks before the party. That meant when Daniel stood in that ballroom and turned me into a joke, he had already been handed a written warning explaining exactly how a confidence-heavy strategy could collapse into reputational damage before the business had time to correct itself. He did not humiliate me because I was paranoid. He humiliated me because I threatened the script. That realization removed the last trace of family feeling from the business side of what happened. This was no longer sibling cruelty in a moment of ego. It was tactical discrediting. And once I knew that, I also knew there would be no real repair. Only fallout. After the second major stock drop, the company stopped feeling like a family triumph and started feeling like a family emergency. Our father stopped quoting Daniel's growth projections to relatives. Our mother stopped posting supportive messages online. Even my aunt, who had been quickest to laugh, began calling the situation complicated, which is the family word people use when they want to retreat from a position without admitting they were wrong. Daniel, meanwhile, did what men like him often do when the story starts failing. He doubled down on tone, publicly calm, internally furious. He held staff meetings about resilience, narrative discipline, and avoiding panic language. That last phrase filtered back to me through someone still inside. Avoiding panic language. Not solving the pressure. Not reducing the gap between promise and capacity. Managing the mood. That told me the company still had leadership problems even after the first visible consequences. One evening, my father came to my house with a folder. He looked older than he had a month earlier. Not fragile, just diminished in the particular way men look when a son's success had become part of their own self-concept and is now slipping publicly through their hands. He set the folder on my table and said he had met with Daniel privately. Inside were printouts. Not everything, but enough. Cash flow summaries, a covenant review note, and one internal email where Leonard wrote that public founder Tome must stay ahead of temporary balance sheet anxiety. My father asked what that sentence meant. I told him it meant exactly what it sounded like. It meant they knew the balance sheet pressure was real and believed confidence had to outpace it publicly in order to preserve strategic room. He asked if that was normal. I said not if you want my honest answer. He sat there quietly for a while. Then he said something I had been waiting for without realizing it. He said, "You were not wrong at that party. Simple. Late. But real." I nodded and thanked him, but the moment did not heal anything. Because the deeper wound was not being right. It was being made ridiculous on purpose by people who already knew enough to take my warning seriously. My mother came by 2 days later, not with a folder, with tears. She said the room at the party got away from them. She said she thought Daniel was only teasing, that she laughed because everyone else did, that once a crowd commits to a mood it feels harder to stop it than people realize. All of that may have been true, but it was not enough. I told her the reason it hurt was not just the laughter. It was that none of them came after me when I left. No one stepped into the hallway. No one texted, that went too far. The first message I got asked me not to make it about my feelings. She cried harder after that. Sometimes people do not fully understand what they participated in until the outcome strips away whatever prestige made it seem harmless. That does not erase responsibility, but it explains why so many families protect the lie while it still looks profitable. The company survived, but not as the same company. That matters. This was not a total wipeout. It was, in some ways, worse for the people inside it. A controlled decline. Board oversight increased. The CFO was forced out under language so polished it almost sounded generous. Daniel retained a title for a while, then shifted into what the press described as an advisory strategic transition, which was cleaner wording for reduced authority after credibility damage. The stock never recovered to where it had been before the party. Clients stayed, but more cautiously. Lenders tightened. Growth slowed. The mythology died. And that is the part our family felt most painfully. Not only the money, the loss of narrative. For years, Daniel's rise had allowed everyone around him to feel they belonged to something winning. My father felt successful through him. My mother felt secure through him. Our extended family treated his momentum like proof that the family itself was ascending. When that collapsed, they all had to face a more humiliating truth than the market decline. They had laughed at the one person in the room who was trying, however imperfectly, to make them look at reality before it turned public. Exposed stories media exists because families do this all the time. They mistake confidence for character. They protect the story that makes them feel proud. They punish the person who threatens the illusion. Then, when the illusion breaks on its own, they act shocked that no one warned them in a way they could hear. Daniel reached out to me one final time months later. Not by text. He asked to meet in person. I almost refused, but in the end I said yes because part of me needed to hear whether he had truly understood what he did or whether he still thought the problem was only that the company got caught by reality too soon. We met at a hotel bar near the interstate. Neutral territory. The kind of place where people say hard things in low voices because no one there knows their names. He looked tired, not theatrically broken, still polished, still controlled, but the effort of holding the old image together showed now in ways it never had before. He said he was sorry. That word alone meant less than people think. I waited. Then he said the party had been a mistake. He admitted he knew I was becoming a threat to the confidence narrative he needed the room to absorb. He said if investors began seeing internal skepticism as credible, momentum could stall, and at that stage he believed momentum itself was survival. There it was again. Not ethics. Not truth. Survival through narrative. I asked him if he understood that he had not only embarrassed me. He had taught an entire room to treat my seriousness as entertainment so his optimism would look stronger. He nodded and said yes. Then he said the sentence that ended any chance of closeness. He said, I thought the business needed it. The business needed it. That was his final defense. Not that I had misunderstood. Not that he didn't know. That the company mattered more than my dignity in that moment. I told him then what I had finally learned. That he did not lose me because the business struggled. He lost me because he showed me exactly where I ranked when his image and my humanity came into conflict. And once someone shows you that clearly, love can survive maybe, but trust rarely does. He did not argue. That was the most honest part of the whole conversation. Today, I still speak to my parents. The relationship is different. Less automatic, less willing to pretend. My father asks harder questions now. My mother is more careful with laughter when a room turns against someone for being inconvenient. That may sound small. It is not. As for Daniel, we exist in the same family, but not in the same relationship. I do not hate him. That surprises people sometimes. But hate is noisy. What I feel is quieter. Final. If there is one lesson in this story, it is not simply that my family laughed at me in public and then their business began to fail. It is that people often laugh hardest at the truth they most need to hear when hearing it would cost them status, confidence, or momentum. Public humiliation becomes a defense mechanism, a way to lower the credibility of the person who threatens the story everyone has already decided to love. That is why the laughter mattered. Not because it hurt my feelings, because it revealed what the room was already committed to protecting. And once you see that clearly, the later failure is not ironic. It is almost inevitable. The business did not fail because I was humiliated. It failed because the same mindset that made humiliation useful also made reality easier to postpone than confront. That is true in companies. It is true in families. And it is true anywhere narrative starts mattering more than truth. If this story stayed with you, that may be why exposed stories media continues to matter. Not because collapse is satisfying, because collapse often reveals what success had been hiding. Sometimes the joke is not random. Sometimes the mockery is the earliest public sign that the truth has already become too dangerous for the people in power to let stand on its own. So if a room ever laughs at the person asking the hard question, pay attention. Especially if money is involved. Especially if the laughter feels coordinated. Especially if the people leading it need confidence to stay alive just a little longer. Because sometimes the moment they humiliate you is the moment they reveal how afraid they already are.